So, an introduction to the nervous system. What is the nervous system? Well, the nervous system is a series of, basically cellular wires that are linking, the brain and the spinal cord to, the body. And there's lots of information, coming back and forth, across these networks of interlinked cells. The nervous system is vast, right? It consists of, 86 billion, neurons in the adult brain and a comparable number of what are known as glial cells, which are support cells. Glia is the Greek word for glue, and initially, researchers looked at the brain and thought, the neurons were the critical ones. They're carrying information. They're wire-like. They extend and link to each other. While glia, they're just the glue of the brain. In fact, an early textbook that we used to use for this class would describe the neurons as like the chocolate chips, while the the cookie part in a chocolate chip cookie was the glia, and that got a lot of things wrong. There's about an equal number in the adult brain of neurons and glia, and they both subserve important aspects of brain function. However, the complexity of this system, right? 86 billion neurons just alone, if we're just talking about, neurons, it makes you wonder, how do you get in there and start to figure out, what's happening and what parts are doing what? So there are a couple of ways to approach this. One is sort of a structural approach, right? And then we look at, like, for example, what's here, what's there, for example. And then by virtue of location or structural features, right, we can sort of get a sense of what, is the functional role of these either networks of neurons or, their structural components, right? So one great big structural division that's actually typically, discussed when we're thinking about the nervous system is that between the central nervous system and what's called the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system, or the CNS, consists of the brain and the spinal cord. We're only seeing a little bit of it here, but it extends down, your back here, right, down your spine. And the central nervous system is basically, by virtue of its location, you can say a couple things, right? You can say, for example, that a lot of the complex cognition and sort of motor planning, for complex behavioral responses is certainly going to be, dependent upon networks of neurons that are found in the CNS as opposed to in just the peripheral nervous system. The spinal cord, by virtue of its structural position and location, right, it's clearly carrying incoming, afferent or sensory information, right? This is like information about touch or injury or pressure or that sense of body position, which is called proprioception, right? And also outgoing information. It's got to, if you're going to make a decision up here to go move and to pick up and to, toss this brain in the air, for example, you've got to send motor output, via, the central nervous system, via the spinal cord, to basically carry that motor, or what's often known as efferent output, basically from the brain. So the peripheral nervous system consists of, these neurons, these nerves, these bundles of nerve fibers that are carrying afferent or sensory information in, and also motor output, efferent output, basically to the body. In addition, there are clumps of neurons that are found in various, locations around the organs, the gut, for example. These are actually what we refer to as ganglia. There's like links between cells there. There's synaptic connections that we'll talk about later in this class. And so there's gray matter in these clumps that are found out in the PNS, or peripheral nervous system. And these are referred to as ganglia. In the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, well, you've got, lots of neural networks. We're going to see there's a outer bark of the brain with there's lots of, neurons that are here with very important, networks that are involved in, complex cognition and perception and behavioral responses and things like that. This is at the bark of the brain. The term is Latin for bark, which is the cortex. And then below the cortex, subcortically, are all sorts of important clumps of neurons and their connections that are not called ganglia typically, although we'll talk about an exception later, but they're typically called nuclei. So there's a clump of neurons all interconnected with each other at synaptic connections. Subcortically, below the bark of the brain, that's part of the central nervous system. They're referred to as subcortical nuclei, and they're linked back and forth to areas of cortex as well. So, just by virtue of the location, of these different portions of the nervous system, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, we can say, some functional things about that, right? We can say that this is really critically important for sort of cognition, perception, behavior, to a large extent. And the periphery is important for detection, right, of, sensory stimuli, and also output, motor output, to various, parts of the body, right, to move you around and to have you respond. You can also go at the brain or the nervous system functionally, right? You can make a sort of functional distinction. You could say, for example, let's say, you are walking around, outdoors at dusk, and you're trying to be properly socially distanced, and then you suddenly hear a snap of a twig, like right behind you, far too close, for a pandemic. Well, you're going to suddenly swivel, look, you'll what we call orient, right? Very rapidly. You'll have increased, heart rate. You might have dry mouth. You might feel that sense of, fear or, panic. And that was a whole series of responses that happen sort of automatically and impulsively in response to a stimulus in your environment. Well, that's a functionally cohesive system, right? Versus, for example, if you look around and it's a small, kitten or something, and it's mewling, and you take it home and you pet it, and you're not allergic to cats, and you start to feel better and more relaxed. Well, you're going to have other changes that are occurring sort of all over the body. Well, there are sort of automatic responses or sort of reflexive responses that we generate, our nervous systems generate to specific types of stimuli. For threatening stimuli, for example, like something that we perceived as like something right behind us, there's a division of what we call the autonomic nervous system. That's parts of the nervous system that are involved in sort of automated or reflexive sort of responses to stimuli. And this kind of fight or flight response, right, is associated with what we call the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And interestingly, this is a functional system in the nervous system, right? A functional component of the nervous system that it turns out spans both the central and peripheral nervous systems. So you have, for the sympathetic division, the fight or flight response, you've got neurons. They call them sort of the primary output neurons of the sympathetic division that are located in the spinal cord. Their cell bodies are located there in a nucleus, right? Because you're in the central nervous system. A clump of these neuron cell bodies that's called the intermediolateral cell column, because it goes up and down in the middle, and towards the side, basically, of the spinal cord. And the axons, these are the wire-like projections of these cells, are going to extend out to a clump of neurons in the peripheral nervous system, right? It's actually a series of these clumps that line the spinal cord on either side. They're in the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, so they're leaving through these nerves out into the peripheral nervous system, but there's these clumps called ganglia. They're actually called the sympathetic chain ganglia. And there's going to be a synaptic connection. This first neuron, this one that started in your spinal cord, is going to, have a little gap and release a neurotransmitter onto the secondary neuron. This is called the post-ganglionic cell, because its axon is going to extend out and go, for example, to your heart, right? Or to other organs to speed up your heart rate, to redirect blood flow, to the legs and the core of the body, to generate all sorts of changes that are associated with that fight or flight response. The medical students learn it as, the 4 Fs, fight, flight, fright, and fornication. So this is really preparing the body for action, right? You get energy resources sort of, set just in case something behind you is, something, significant that needs to be dealt with. And what's fascinating is this is a structural organization that I'm describing here of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system that is associated with this functional, kind of fight or flight response, right? Because, if you stimulate, in that intermediate lateral cell common, you get output through this set of chain ganglia to all these body systems. You hit a trip, you sort of go over a threshold, and then boom, you get that full-on, fight or flight response that anybody who's, suffered from panic disorder, for example, or is anybody who's just sort of walked and stepped off a curb wrong and sort of fallen forward, and that freezing, that orienting, that heart rate is, quite familiar with, right? And what's interesting is that this is also tied together by another sort of structural feature, the neurotransmitter, the chemical that is released by the postganglionic cells from those sympathetic chain ganglia onto organs like, the heart, for example, is norepinephrine. It's all sort of tied together, by the same sort of chemical, release upon the organs, that are part of this sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Now, in contrast, right, there is the parasympathetic system, which is important for sort of, energy conservation and sort of relaxing you and calming you down to some extent. And so this system, when you realize it's a kitten and you're all calm and you're not really that stressed at that point, well, this particular system is fascinating. The major output is a nerve called the vagus nerve. So the primary neurons are not located in the spinal cord, in the intermediate lateral cell column or nucleus, like the sympathetic division, but located in the brain stem. And also there's another source of output in the lower portion of the spinal cord. And the medical students learn that the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is critical for SLUD, salivation, lacrimation, which is crying, is tears, right? Urination and defecation. So that's that lower spinal cord, projection. And what's really interesting about it is the source of the primary neurons is different from the other division that we described, the sympathetic division. It's located in the brainstem and lower spinal cord. The secondary neurons are located in ganglia 2, but they're not in a chain like this. They're actually located really close to the organs that they're going to influence. So the sympathetic chain ganglia, right, are going to have a ganglion that'll send postganglionic cells, projections to the heart to speed it up with norepinephrine. Well, for the parasympathetic division, you're going to have, the output, from the brainstem, and it's going to go to ganglia that are actually a ganglion that's right on the heart, pretty much, actually. And then there's going to be a synapse, and then the postganglionic cell will go and release a different neurotransmitter. So this is another structural, aspect that distinguishes these two divisions, these two functional divisions. Sympathetic is norepinephrine, and this parasympathetic slowing of the heart, coming from the vagus nerve, is going to actually be, and from the postganglionic cell there, it's actually going to be acetylcholine. So the point I'm trying to make here is actually, the nervous system is really fascinating. We're talking 86 billion neurons, and then a similar number of glial cells, that are also, we'll talk later about their contributions. But we can, to get a sense of what's going on, we can sort of look at it structurally, sort of divide it up into, for example, the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system. But we can also look at it in terms of functional divisions. And then when we do that, we see that those functionally distinct, components of our nervous system actually have structural features that tie them together. Sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter released. It's got the different primary source in the intermediolateral cell column of the spinal cord. It has sympathetic chain ganglia, right? Long axons to the heart and other, organs, while the parasympathetic division, has acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter, primary neurotransmitter that's released, and different sort of central nervous system sources in the brainstem and the lower spinal cord, and then ganglia that are much closer to the actual organs that they're innervating. So we started, going at, those divisions, via a functional description, and then we find that there are structural features that help to distinguish, that distinguish the two. The other thing I just want to mention about the autonomic nervous system. So, there are other parts of the nervous system that are involved in sort of, deliberate or sort of conscious, movements and, responses that we sometimes talk about as the somatic nervous system, sort of the conscious nervous system. But the autonomic nervous system is sort of posited in contrast to that. And, traditionally, we've thought about the autonomic nervous system, the ANS, as being divided into the, the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. But actually, there's a very critical component of our nervous system, which is actually found in the gut. And this gut neuron, or this gut nervous system, used to be sort of lumped in with like parasympathetic, but now it's such an extensive set of neurons. We're talking about, millions and millions, tens of millions of neurons here. It's often referred to as the second brain. They form these sheets that surround your esophagus, your stomach, your small intestine, your large intestine, and these sheets are called plexi, and they engage in very complex behavioral responses to what they're detecting, what's being detected, in terms of sensation, in the gut, like what you're eating, for example, and consuming. And there's quite an extensive, set of creatures that live in us, right, in the gut. We refer to it as part of our microbiome, which extends to our skin and like all over our bodies. We are a world with all sorts of creatures, and this fascinating work on, the importance of these microbiome species and, the kind of ecosystem that you maintain in terms of influencing the nervous system as a whole. But this particular, set of extensive neuronal connections and neurons, that are found, all over, and glial cells that are also found all over this, this gut system. This has been separated out as another division of the autonomic nervous system. It's known as the enteric nervous system. And actually, there's a really interesting field called neuro, is brain, gastro, the gut, enterology, which is like the study of this, the connections between, the gut and the brain. So I want you to think about, the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, right? Being critical for, higher cognitive functions, the, behaviors, perceptions, etc. The spinal cord is a component of that central nervous system, being really important for the transit, of input, both afferent coming in and efferent going out. And also, we're going to see some sort of reflexive responses at the level of the cord. The peripheral nervous system consisting of, nerves, both afferent, projections coming in, carrying sensory information about your world, right? And also efferent, motor output, extending out, to your body to move and respond. Ganglia are going to be clumps of neurons that are found in that peripheral nervous system, where there are synaptic connections being made and information's being transferred chemically from one cell to another. But then we can also go in functionally, right? And look at, the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic fight or flight, the parasympathetic sort of, rest and, energy conservation. And now also this very independently operating enteric nervous system, sometimes referred to as the second brain, that basically you're linked to. There's a lot of afferent input, coming from your enteric division of the autonomic nervous system, from the gut to the central nervous system. You're aware of your gut, but actually quite a limited amount of motor output. You don't have much control over it. You can certainly, depending on your mood and experience, have influence over